The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland, in the northern part of what is, on this show, tied for the best state in the country. It's tied with Wisconsin today because my guest is returning and he's from Wisconsin. And we were talking off the air about the joys of being from Wisconsin. I had several friends in the Air Force that were from the Milwaukee area. And it's just Midwest, a mellow kind of life. Am I right? Lee Kluck.
Well, it
returning to the airwaves.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you.
Yeah. Tell me about life in Wisconsin a little bit.
Well, most people think it's cold and snowy, and that's true. There's about a 6-month gap there where it pretty much seems like you're going to get snow at any moment.
Yeah.
9 months out of the year even. But it is, like you said, most people are pretty chill and just kind of let you be how you're going to be. And, we fortify ourselves with enough beer, cheese, and sausage for about every other state in the union. And we chase that back with what they call a Brandy Old Fashioned, which is it's a little different than what is normally an Old Fashioned in most parts of the country. This has a little orange juice in it, and orange peel, and cherries and bitters, and you put it over put it over brandy with some cherries in it. You muddle that all together, and there's a saying that if you can see over the bar, you can order that at a wedding. So, they're pretty much, we're good-natured people, and
let people be.
Let people be who they want to be.
Yeah, that's nice.
And here's the thing: if you're not going to let us be who we want, we've got enough stick-to-itiveness to tell you off. So that helps too.
It certainly does. Lee, you are so mellow, and it's so nice to talk to you. Let's refresh the audience memory of what you're doing. You're working on a book on one of the most underrated baseball executives of our time. And would you explain it, Lee?
Yeah, so it seems like many moons ago, but it's actually gone very quick in comparison to the fun I've been having doing the project. For those who don't know, I'm a historian. I got a master's degree in history from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, which is a satellite campus of the UW system. And about halfway through my master's program, I had a heart attack at 28. And it kills about 99% of the people. The one that I had. And so when my number didn't come up, I was very fortunate. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to use my degree, even if it's for myself. So the last 10 or 12 years, I've been working as a public historian and a sports historian primarily. And so I've been writing a biography of, I've loved baseball forever and ever. And so I'm writing a biography of Harry Dalton, who was the general manager and who I argue was the first modern general manager in the standpoint that he didn't worry about, he was the first in a long line of GMs that didn't worry about TV contracts and what they were paying the beer vendor and what they were paying to clean the stadium. He was concerned about team building. And
did he work with someone who took care of all that? because
Well,
even though he wasn't interested, it had to get done in running a ball club.
Yep. So that is, and some people see it as a distraction. So Harry worked for Baltimore from 1954. He got out of the United States Air Force. He did a stint in Korea. He did 37 months as a public relations officer. And then he got a job with the fledgling Baltimore Orioles in their first year in Major League Baseball. And worked for the Orioles from the winter of 1953 up until the fall of 1971, right after the World Series. And so what he did, and it was mainly because some people see it as a distraction or as a detraction. He actually, on paper, reported to Frank Cashin, who, as you may know, as a Mets fan,
Yes,
was
I do.
GM of the mid-'80s and of the New York Mets.
And he built the 1986 team that won it all.
Yep, that's right. And him and another Dalton sort of disciple, Joe McElvain, was the farm director of that team. And so when Harry worked in Baltimore, he worked on paper. He reported to Frank Cashin, who was the layer between him and Jerry Hoffberger, the owner, who was the president of, among other things, National Brewing Company. They made National Bohemian for you East Coasters. And
your West Coasters.
Huh?
And your West Coasters.
Well, yeah, Natty Bo got around, I suppose. It's like everything else. But so there was a layer between Harry and Jerry Hoffberger, and that layer was Frank Cashin. Now, as I will argue in my book, Cashin believes that this didn't make Dalton a true GM. He did said that in his memoirs, but it was more or less, I think it was an opportunity for him to try to point out that he had more to do with it than he actually did. Research shows that in Baltimore, especially in the early years, he didn't know a lot about baseball, and he didn't have a lot of input into the baseball aspects of it. He was a troubleshooter that Jerry Hoffberger would bring into different businesses. He worked at Aqueduct and some of these other places. And and he would come in and troubleshoot and sort of be a PR guy, and that's what he was doing in Baltimore primarily. Was the Colts, for those who remember back so far, Baltimore was a football town. Johnny Unitas and
Marty Donovan from the Bronx.
Yep. The Baltimore Colts. And so the Orioles had a real problem sort of breaking that barrier of that fan base. Says, hey, we can be a baseball town. So in Baltimore, Harry Dalton, even though he was the third man technically on the totem pole by looking at a flow chart, what we would do today, he ran the baseball operations. So I argue he's the first modern general manager because he didn't, but Frank Cashin did. Frank Cashin took care of all that other stuff, and as Harry's career, as Harry moved on, right, there were more and more people. Dan Duquette has told me numerous times. Dan worked for Harry in Milwaukee, and that was his first job right out of college. And Dan Duquette told me, he says, we used to sit around, and he goes, today they'd need 4 people to do what Harry did. Wow. They would have 4 separate people to do what Harry did. And that was mainly just run the baseball ops. So he was the first one that said, no, I'm going to focus on building the team. And And he did some PR work, and, you know, he was always very out front with the ball club and making sure that they were, you know, received well in the community. But in about 1971, in 1971, they got beat for the second time in 3 years in the World Series. First time was by the 69 Mets, and in 1971, the Orioles lost to the Pittsburgh Pirates, and Roberto Clemente had a fantastic series and pretty much single-handedly beat the Orioles. And after that series, Baltimore was scheduled to go to Japan on a goodwill tour. They went as far as they were going to take the wives, and they were teaching the wives Japanese, and it was supposed to be this, you know, they had been the best team in baseball for the last 3 seasons plus, and so it was supposed to be this big deal.
You had those 4 20-game winners in 71.
Yep.
And can you name them off the top of your head? Palmer was one. Okay.
Yep.
Please
Jim
do.
Palmer, Mike Cuellar, Dave McNally, and Mike Crazy Horse Cuellar.
Okay. And that was Dobson one of those? No.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry. I apologize. It was Pat Dobson, Jim Palmer, Mike Cuellar, and Dave McNally. Yep.
Okay. All right. They, I had a sports table game, Status Pro or Sports Illustrated, and it happened to be the 71 season. This was in 72 that I bought. And I was so blown away with how they rated Baltimore and that pitching staff.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, you'll never have that again, right? They're the last team that will ever have 4 20-game winners on it.
Right.
You know,
let alone,
Atlanta did in the mid-90s.
We may never get another 20-game winning season from anybody, the way things are going. So,
so you know, there's been very few. I think Atlanta had maybe one set in the 90s where Smoltz and Maddox and Glavine and Steve Avery would have been the fourth one.
Right.
Who's the kind of the throw-in in that bunch, was a very good pitcher for a lot of years. He won 20 games. But unbeknownst to the public, Harry Dalton was a very quiet guy, went about his business, did his job, never felt that he was owed anything by anyone. But after 3 years of just unmitigated success, he believed that the Baltimore Orioles owed him more than a 1-year deal. What I don't think a lot of people realize is that we think of player contracts in that time period under the reserve clause as being 1-year deals that the club could just perpetually renew.
Right.
And there was no free agency and there was no movement. What you realize is that in a lot of cases, managers and executives were put under the same scrutiny. And they were put under the same restrictions. So actually, Harry Dalton, for all the years he worked in Baltimore, some years he says he didn't even have a contract. He just worked, and they made it right. Some years he says he had it. If it was written down, it was a 1-year contract, and Jerry Hofberger would just renew it at the end of the year. Well, Dalton began to believe, much like the players. In fact, he uses this word in a letter that he wrote with his resignation to Jerry Hofberger and Frank Cashin. He goes, I believe that, you know, no one has been more loyal to this team than I have since the day it started. He literally was like the third person hired.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's been more loyal to this team than me. I've done everything I can to get this team where it is, and I'm glad to have done it. But what you're doing is paternalism. You're telling me what's best for me. And I can't let you do that anymore. And there was some people would argue that it was underhanded. Gene Autry had made inquiries. Excuse me. Gene Autry had made inquiries about bringing Dalton to California. The Angels had been born in 1961 in the big leagues, taking the name from the Pacific Coast League Angels.
Right.
And they had one winning season in a little over 10 years. And Gene Autry, sort of in a backhanded deal, convinced Harry Dalton that he should come to California, and he would be the GM of the Angels, and he would report to no one, and he would come in, and he could hopefully replicate what he did in Baltimore with California. He was the most well-known GM in the game at that time, which is another one of my points, is that he was a celebrity. He was that era's Theo Epstein, okay? He was
the Trader Lane that worked.
Yep. He was, yeah. Well, and it's funny. Frank Lane worked for Harry Dalton.
Did he really?
Yeah, Frank Lane worked for Harry Dalton in Baltimore, and then he worked for Harry again in, I want to say, Milwaukee or California. I know he worked for him in Baltimore, man. I want to say he worked for him in California too. It escapes me at this moment, but Frank Lane worked for him, and as sort of Harry was a guy that loved information, so he never felt like his people could learn too much. He was never someone that hid things from people because he wanted to be the sole proprietor of information. So he would bring in guys that would teach his people and teach himself the ins and outs of baseball. So, I mean, he had Jim McLaughlin was on his staff in Baltimore. McLaughlin was his first boss, and then when he was fired, and Harry Dalton took over as the farm director in Baltimore. So then when Harry becomes the GM, he hires Jim McLaughlin back to be their head of what becomes amateur scouting. He had Walter Shannon of the St. Louis Cardinal fame, who had built the Bob Gibson, Tim McCarver, Mike Shannon Cardinals of the 60s. He would just have these Fred Hoffman, who was a scout. He would have these baseball people around that were in the game a long time.
He'd be drawing from them, and they'd be drawing from him. It was
exactly.
So they felt part of it, and he was doing it his way, which is
and that was the thing. Perry was the first one to say that he was the final arbitrator of all decisions. But he would go around the room and go, okay, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Even if it was just, he would send out a survey at the end of the year to all his scouts and his front office staff and go, who in the league right now can make our team better? I don't even care if you put down Willie Mays. Okay, Willie Mays. I don't even care if it's someone that on paper we can't get. But who do you think will make our team better? Because out of that list would be one or two or three guys that could make their team better. You know, in that, hey, I saw this guy and he's going to be in the Rule 5. And, that's how they ended up with Mo Drabowski in Baltimore. Mo Drabowski of World Series fame in '66. Yeah. Struck out 11 men in relief. And
Hank Bauer was the manager of that. One of my boyhood heroes.
Hank Bauer. And, they ended up with Paul Blair that way. And so, it was it was just they would get those people like that. Elrod Hendricks was another guy that they picked up off the virtual scrap heap. Mike Cuellar was a guy that they got. Well, anyway, fast forward back, and what I show in my book is that all of these periods are sort of intertwined, right? The faces are the same, and his methods have become sort of the same, though it tweaks depending on where he is. So he goes and signs a deal with California, and he and his gang of advisors and his gang of scouts, and he takes a lot of the Baltimore guys with him. And if they don't come over right away, they come over eventually. But he takes a lot of the Baltimore guys with him, and they go and set up shop in Anaheim. And it, for reasons that most people don't get publicly, it doesn't work. The Angels don't even have a 500 season between 1972 and 1977.
These were the Bobby Grish years, am I correct?
No, it's just well, yeah, he came over after free agent. So Dalton tries the first couple years to get the farm system in Anaheim rebuilt from nothing, because he knows that is how they did it in Baltimore, and he's a farm system guy. He was the assistant farm director. He was the farm director. He believes in homegrown talent. So Gene Autry becomes impatient and is very swayed by that other team in LA. I can't
even say, as an old Giant fan, I can't even say the name.
Yeah. So the team that shall remain nameless, that plays in Chavez Ravine.
Yeah.
And so Gene Autry is sort of enamored with the Dodgers and what they do, and he becomes antsy for a winner. And in 1975, when the Seitz decision comes down, the next year, 1976, Harry Dalton makes probably the first mega splash in free agency. Now, some people will point to Jim Hunter because he was the first guy that people just went Google after, when his contract was voided in Oakland.
Charlie Finley.
Yeah, Charlie Finley forgot to pay his insurance policy and voided his
annuity. Right.
Yep, and voided his deal. So in '76, Dalton realizes that free agency is there; it's going to stay, and he convinces Gene Autry that they should spend on average of about $1 million apiece for 3 players, 2 of which had come up in the Baltimore system. One was Don Baylor, the other was Bobby Grich, and the third player was off of Finley's Oakland teams, Joe Rudy.
Oh, okay. Don't remember Rudy with the Angels, but now I do, the more I think about it. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, and so that's part of the thing that doesn't work out is that he signs them to deals, and then those 3 players go through. Rudy's talents declined precipitously, from his time in Oakland. Bobby Grich got hurt lifting a air conditioner, and his back was messed up for about a year and a half. Ooh. And Don Baylor went through a slump where he was kind of hurt and not playing real well. And so that heaped a lot of pressure on Harry Dalton as well. But Dalton, he tries to change managers a few times. He brings in Bobby Winkles, who is the first time a college coach was ever hired directly to manage a big league team. Bobby just died this.
If I'm not mistaken, or Arizona.
Arizona State.
Yeah. Yes.
and so Bobby, who just died earlier this year, was Harry's manager for a while. He had Del Rice, I want to say, was a manager there for a period.
Hey, you mentioned Mo Drabowski. He recently passed away as well.
Yeah, and it's one of these things too where I see those types of things, and I make sure the Daltons are still the girls and Harry's wife Pat are still very interested in the people that they knew in that life. They kind of question sometimes whether they actually lived through it, because it seems like it's a different world. That they went through all these things.
Hey, tell me something about Harry that people that are away from the baseball, that's away from the baseball stuff. A little.
So we're going to get a lot of that. We're going to get a lot of that in the book too. And I can tell you two things. One is he was the father of three. At one point, he was the father of three teenage girls. And so, like anyone with teenage children, but teenage girls especially, he dealt with a lot of the same stuff. Coming in late or dating and all these other things, so
kids growing up.
Yeah, he had his family life. The other thing that I can tell you, now his family life may include teaching his daughters how to drive the family car in the parking lot of the Big A. They may include, riding in the Disney Christmas parade, but they still had very normal childhoods and he was a normal dad. He got upset. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He was like that at work either. He didn't yell. He didn't scream, but he would tell you that he was disappointed. And the girls have all told me that if Dad looked at you and said, well, I'm disappointed, then you knew that you had really messed up. Yep, you had really messed up. And so the other thing that Harry, I think people don't realize, is that Harry Dalton was very smart and had a very dry wit. And so he would do things, practical jokes and different things to get people to laugh, and would allow people to do, to play the occasional prank on him, because it was a way for him to sort of connect with people. The most famous example is, for those who don't know, Baltimore ran a kangaroo court, which is a holdover of baseball clubhouses.
Frank Robinson ran that, if I'm not mistaken.
Was the judge, that's right. And Frank would put a string mop on his head and a black towel or a towel. He'd put a towel over his shoulders, and he would put a string mop on his head and hold court about, they'd fine for errors and they'd fine for just boneheaded mistakes or not being professional enough, and it was a way for the team to connect. Well, one day Robinson is holding court and Harry Dalton walks in, and Frank stops and looks him up and down, and he goes, Dalton, that'll be a $20 fine. We shine our shoes in this outfit. and the whole room goes completely silent, because they're wondering what the new boss is going to do. And Harry got out his wallet, laid a $20 bill down on the table, and that was it. The room broke up, and he was one of the boys. Yeah, Don Buford told me that Harry was one of the guys. And Bobby Grich told me the same thing when he was in California. Most people, when the GM would walk around, you get real tight, you get real nervous. You would, but with Harry, you would just feel like he wanted to know about your life. He just wanted you to do your job, and he wanted to, so he'd laugh with you sometimes or whatever. Always demanded respect, always had, the best interest of the ball club at heart, but he was not above showing people that sense of humor if you caught him in the right way.
Hey, Lee, let me ask you a question, a personal question about yourself. This is such a major project in your life. What, when it's completed, are you going to get onto? Have you thought about that at all?
I have, and I've given it some thought. And I'm kind of at a crossroads. I can go a couple different ways. Whether I go with baseball or if I, growing up, I was a huge college basketball fan, so I've also thought about doing something in college basketball.
Right.
Looking at the evolution of college basketball from a popularity standpoint, and what factors brought it to the point where it is this multi-billion-dollar industry. For better or for worse, to give you the honest truth, I don't really follow college athletics nearly as much as I used to. But it was a big part of my life for about a 20 or 25 years, 15-year stretch in the wintertime. But all I know right now is that I'm giving Harry his due, and that is okay with me. In fact, I already know that I will feel a little sad when I don't get to walk around in his life.
That's what I mean. It's become a part of you, and you have to. You don't have to, but it'd be nice if you can replace it with something that you're passionate about. And
so this is my first book too. I think that's the thing. Like, this is my first book. It's not, and I didn't set out to go, you know what, I'm going to write a book about Harry Dalton.
Right.
It was one of these things that just came up organically and was like, hey, this guy built some teams that I really liked. And then you look at his career and you're like, wow, he worked for a really long time. I mean, he had 15 years in pro baseball when he left Baltimore. And he worked from 1954, the winter of 53, into the 54 season until the fall of 1994. So he worked in baseball for 40 years.
Whoa.
And just think of all the changes that occur over that 40-year stretch of baseball, right?
No question about it.
You can track those changes and show what that was like to try to build a winner at each one of those stages. So, for instance, in California, we talked about his 3 big free agency, but his first big splash was he traded Jim Fregosi for a wild, skinny kid from Alvin, Texas.
I'm a Mets fan. So this is not easy for me, but it's true.
So he trades Jim Fregosi for a skinny, wild, right-armed Texan who would go on to win over 300 games and amass strikeout numbers that no one had ever seen. His name was Nolan Ryan.
Yes.
So when Harry we talked about pitching and the importance of it in Baltimore. Harry is a firm believer in pitching and will remain a firm believer in pitching until he is out of the game and gone. So he's got Frank Tanana, who is a lefty, very accomplished at a young age, pitching very well in California for some bad teams. He then trades for Nolan Ryan. And I had the pleasure of talking to Nolan for about 20 or 25 minutes one day about his time in California and his time with Harry. And he said that Harry Dalton was one of the most important reasons for why Nolan Ryan became Nolan Ryan. And what I mean by that is, you see, we picture Nolan at the end of his career where he was this dominant force that would just blow people away and could do it in a myriad of different ways, and this giant competitor. And what you don't think about is that when he first broke into the big leagues, he was wild. He didn't really know where the ball was going all the time. Not Steve Delkowski wild, not that kind of wild. He could harness it, but it wasn't. There was a time when Nolan Ryan threw 250 pitches in a game for California. So you sit there and go, okay, but he says Harry believed that I could pitch, and he let me learn by doing it. He let me go out there every 4 days and throw, and soon Ryan became the most dominant pitcher, one of the most dominant pitchers of the 1970s, and one of the most transformative pitchers for the next 30 years. So he's got 2 starters. Then he brings over Bobby Grich, Don Baylor, and Joe Rudy. And at one point they had Bobby Bonds, who seemed like a good idea. But what you get is a situation in the front office where you're getting mixed messages. And by that I mean Gene Autry was like I said, he was very enamored with the Dodgers. And for whatever reason, he felt that he could bring over some of the Dodger people and sort of harness whatever it had and mix it together with the guys from Baltimore and make the Angels a winner. So he brings over Red Patterson, who is in the office, and sort of becomes a go-between Gene Autry and Harry Dalton. And then in the 1976, in the spring of 76, Gene gets a letter, an anonymous letter, that he actually forwarded to Harry Dalton, and I've read. He had a copy of it in his papers, Harry did. And it was, Gene, people around baseball, they're laughing at you. They don't know why you keep giving money to this Harry Dalton. We know that you re-signed his deal, after the 73 season for 74, 75, 76. We don't know why you did it. People don't like him. His own players don't like him. He's shafted people on trades. And it's the total antithesis of anything you've ever heard or read about Harry Dalton and how he did business. And I remember reading this letter and going, wow. And it was anonymous.
Uh-huh.
And I asked Harry's daughters about it and Pat Dalton, and the first thing they said was, did Buzzy Bavasi write it? And Buzzy Bavasi was of course, he was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Right.
And he worked in LA, and he was very thrifty, to put it mildly, with Walter O'Malley's money. And he had spent some time in San Diego, and he was looking to get back into baseball, and he convinced, through this letter or not, though the evidence would suggest that I think even Harry Dalton thought that Buzzy wrote it. There were numerous references to how Harry had wronged some former Dodgers, and one in particular being John Roseborough. And it leads one to believe that Buzzy was the author. But Buzzy convinces Gene Autry that Harry is spending his money unwisely, and that what he needs to bring in Buzzy as sort of a financial control to rein Harry in. And that this would be the best way for him to really take control back of his club. Well, from the minute he signs there as sort of this, again, I don't even remember what his official title was, but he was Dalton's boss and reported to Gene Autry. But the problem was that it was never clearly defined. In Harry's mind, he still had all the baseball decisions, but yet every time he tried to do something, he was undermined by Buzzy Bavasi.
Yeah.
And I talked to Ross Newhan, who covered the Angels for years and years and years for the papers in L.A. and the Orange County Register, and he said basically what it was is that you had a team starting with the owner that didn't know how they wanted to win, and they didn't allow Harry the freedom to do what he felt would make them a winner long term. And Ross actually puts a lot of Harry's failures in, and by Harry I mean his guys too, because again he took a lot of those guys with him, right? The Ray Scarboroughs and the Ray Poinevents and the Walter Youses, they all came over from Baltimore and worked to build a farm system, especially that would produce winning talent. And they started to. They produced Brian Downing. They produced some of these guys that would become stalwarts in the Angel lineup in the 80s. And they also produced pieces that would be part of integral trades that were made. So what happens is Dalton is undercut basically the entire back half of his time in California. And eventually what happens is he asks Gene, he asks Gene Autry, am I in charge or is he? And while he was not, he was the kind of guy that couldn't keep it in. He was just going to find out, right? Well, I mean, he would keep it in. That was the thing. He was respectful enough. And even in the letters where he wrote Gene about, hey, what's going on here? Please explain to me what you see as how things should work. It wasn't, hey, you're doing this to me and you promised me you wouldn't. It's,
right.
Please explain to me how you feel that this is supposed to work. And I'll make it work. Because here's the other thing. Harry Dalton always believed that the owner, no matter what, was in charge. If later on, and the famous example, and we'll talk about this someday, is the famous example is with Bud Selig. Later on, he and Bud did not have the best relationship at the end of Harry's career. And at one point, when Harry was let go and people were trying to get Harry fired up and upset about that and the way it happened, Harry just looked at him and says, hey, he paid me well. He took care of me. He took care of my family, and he's the boss. If he wants to get rid of me, that's what he can do.
Would you tell me how it happened real briefly?
Yep.
Please.
Oh, Milwaukee? Yeah.
Yeah, at the end.
At the end, yeah. So in 1991, Milwaukee had been maybe not a playoff team, but they had been very relevant in a really tough American League East for a number of years throughout the mid-'80s and early '90s. They had two surefire Hall of Famers in their lineup in Paul Molitor and Robin Yount. And then they also had an up-and-coming, who Harry thought would be an up-and-coming superstar in Gary Sheffield. And for whatever reason, Sheffield didn't work out because there were just some big personality clashes. The things that you associate with Gary Sheffield were happening the minute he came into the league. They didn't develop over time. So
I'm going to tell you a quick story, Lee. I was the top guy in Gary Sheffield's first year in organized ball, and I got to meet him in Stockton. And he was, as I will portray in my upcoming book, not the best of human beings.
No, and that was very evident to Harry Dalton, but he tried In fact, he was finally traded in 1991 after Dalton had been let go, but Harry had tried to trade him a few times and was told by management, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to trade this guy. You need to figure out a way to work with him. And there was just a whole lot of undercurrent. Well, anyway, there was a lot of just bad sort of, I don't know if Harry did anything to facilitate it. I don't think so. I've asked, and, I've even asked totally impartial people, and they said no. I had one person speak on a sort of anonymity basis that basically said, I'm very good friends with Commissioner Seelig, but I was not very happy with how that happened. What he did was he basically alienated Harry Dalton after a while, and Bud was told that, by someone that I can do this job better. I'm more equipped to do it in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, when the numbers are becoming bigger and there's more money involved. And so at the end of the 91 season, Harry is, on paper, he is promoted to sort of the president of baseball operations. But really what happens is that he is shelved away. And he was only given a promotion on paper because when the club offered him his severance to buy out his contract, he says no, because they gave him the option. Well, you can either work, but you won't run the team, or you can retire. And they assumed that he would retire or at least leave Milwaukee. And he told them, no, I'm going to work. I'm going to keep working. So he comes to work for the next 3 years till the strike happened in 94, where he doesn't really do a lot. He is kept in an office on the complete other end of the stadium than the rest of the baseball staff.
Oh, wow.
He is completely isolated. He is shoehorned in a closet basically with the junior PR man, and he works on sort of feasibility studies for Seelig as far as baseball's whether baseball would work in Arizona, for instance. He does a lot of that legwork that leads to the Diamondbacks, but he is just, and the people that still worked, because here's the thing, when he got let go, they did not fire his people. So they kept everybody who worked for him. They just got rid of him. So there are people around who worked for him that couldn't believe what was happening. And eventually he finishes out his career sort of unceremoniously and literally rides off into the sunset into Arizona, into retirement. But the end of his time in Milwaukee was really, I mean, it's a sad part of a really good, just career. An unbelievable career and an unbelievable person. And so his time in California, the reason he ends up in Milwaukee is that his time in California just does not work out. And while he is not fired by Gene Autry, at the end of the 77 season, his contract is not renewed. And then Buzzy Bavasi, believe it or not, goes on and leads the Angels to the pennant and the division title in 78 and a pennant in 82, using a host of players that were Dalton holdovers. And what I find really funny is that Bavasi argued that Harry Dalton was spending too much money, yet you look going forward, and Bavasi would spend huge amounts of money on Lyman Bostic and Reggie Jackson and Rod Carew and Bob Boone and all of these.
If Lyman hadn't been killed, that really would have added to it, because he was.
Well, and that's the thing. That is a tragic part of that whole thing, because he was very good, and he would have been a very good hitter in that lineup. But Harry Dalton, even after he left California, he got a letter one day from Gene Autry in '78, and at that point, Milwaukee was on the rise. They had started to acquire some talent. They had some homegrown talent. They started acquiring some talent. Harry Dalton comes in and he does some things that really solidifies how good the team was, even in the late 70s. And Gene Autry sends him a letter from the Orange County Register that basically says, hey, the Angels won the division this year, and before you lavish all this praise on Buzzy Bavasi and his people for what he did, remember that Harry Dalton put this team in a pretty good spot when he left.
Oh, what a nice thing. What a nice thing to say.
Yeah, well, and then this was a writer. It wasn't Gene, but Gene sort of reiterated the fact. He says, before we get ahead of ourselves, they did this work. And in fact, Nolan Ryan, when I asked Nolan about it, and Nolan had a very contentious relationship with Buzzy Bavasi. In fact, that was part of the reason why he left California shortly after Dalton left, was because he and Buzzy just did not. Buzzy believed that you could still stonewall people, financially especially, and he says he was nothing like Harry, and Harry treated me as good as any general manager had ever treated me, and any success that we've had in California after he left was set up directly by the time that he spent there.
Wow.
And Bobby Grich said the same thing. Bobby Grich, who had his second half of his career with California, was very, very good. And he said that one of the reasons why he came back so hard was because he wanted to prove to people that Harry Dalton had done things the right way, that he knew what he was talking about. And so he has a big comeback. Don Baylor has a big couple of comeback years in the early 80s for Anaheim. And so it sort of shows that, even Frank Tanana, when he left California and went to Detroit, even he had, solid years. So
he came back a different pitcher from Tommy John.
Well, he was a much different pitcher. That is correct. But it still went to show that,
you could do it. You could adjust, and it's pitching, not just throwing.
Yeah, and it proved that the talent evaluation was still there, that he was still a good player. And I think that's the thing. So when he goes and he leaves California, even though his time in California, you could say, was not a success, what you could say is that he proved that his system eventually, given the right parameters, would work. And you see the full fruition of that in Milwaukee.
Right,
so
exactly.
You will see the full fruition.
When is your book, Lee, as we come to the end, because it's just a matter of time like anything else. You and I could talk for 4 hours in a row.
Oh, yeah, no. We could fill a whole day probably, and that's I appreciate you giving me the time to come in and talk to you, Ralph, and to talk to your listeners. It's always a good time.
When is your book due out, and how can they get it? How can people get it?
I hope to have it to the publisher. In fact, I've been editing, and a good portion of it is done. I've had some medical issues the sort of for most of the year, so I've not as far along as I had hoped. But I am gonna get the manuscript to the University of Nebraska Press, and their fine folks, led by Rob Taylor, hopefully by September of this year, and then it would be about a year between that time and the time that it would actually be published. So I'm hoping in 2022 we're going to see Leave While the Party's Good, The Lifetimes and Legacy of Harry Dalton.
Beautiful, beautiful. You're a terrific guest. I'm glad I had you back, and I just enjoy your company.
Well, that means a lot, and I appreciate that. And again, happy holidays to you and your listeners, and thank you so much for having me. I'll come back anytime.
Got to say, around this time of year, happy Rockefeller too.
So this is true.
Very true. All right. Yes, happy holidays to you too, my friend.
All right.
And we will see you down the baseball road. I'm Ralph Mark Tyko. I don't use that name. It's my mother's birthday today as we record.
Oh, happy birthday, Mom.
Well, I don't think that's going to get through. She's long gone.
Well,
but
I can throw it out there.
You can, and she's the one who named me Mark. I go by Zig as my middle name now, and it doesn't mean I don't think about her once in a while, and I do on her birthday.
Yep. Well, that's everybody. Everybody has different things, and you matriculate through the world your own way, but that's nice to know that you know it's there, right?
Yeah, and it's nice to know that old Kansas City coach comes out of your vocabulary once in a while as we matriculate down the highway. Thank you, sir. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I want to thank everybody who listens. And the guest was Lee Kluck, second time in the zone. I hope there are many more. Thanks, Lee. Be well.
Thanks, Ralph.
All right. And again, thanks for listening, everybody. Happy holidays and happy trails. Adios.
You there, Ralph? Gone? Gone.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.